is needs to be a very sharp distinction between physical training and skill training. So physical training is just a matter of using a protocol that very effectively loads, recruits, and fatigues muscle. And skill training is very, very specific. So whatever skill it is you want to acquire, you should do that by rehearsing exactly that skill. And the problem is that you're trying to invoke fatigue with physical training and nothing else. With skill training, you're trying to encode skill patterns while avoiding fatigue, because fatigue will create multiple different pathways for that particular skill set and undermine the acquisition of the skill. So skill training and physical training need to be two separate entities. And once you do that, then you can get the best of both worlds. I just watched the Netflix documentary on the Redeem team, the United States basketball Olympic team, after they lost in '96 and 2000, 2004, the team that was going to win back the gold. And one of the major problems that, they recruited all these NBA players was the Olympic basketball was different than an NBA basketball. So the rubber stripes on the NBA basketball, there's 6 of them. But on an Olympic basketball, there's 8. And it ever so slightly changes the mechanics of the ball. But the thing is, the more slight the difference, the more it befuddles the skill, what you're actually going after. Now, if we're talking about physical training to improve physical capacity, work capacity, then by definition, you have to do something of sufficient intensity to trigger an adaptation. If you're doing something repetitively that's well within your current capabilities, there's no stimulus to adapt. You
Great
have
point.
to really push the limits with intensity to challenge your current level of capabilities and try to exceed it. That is what's going to invoke a depth of fatigue that is going to demand an adaptation from your body. But make no mistake, it's not the exercise that produces the change. That's simply the stimulus. But you've got to cross a certain stimulus threshold for your body to then adapt. But again, make no mistake, the exercise does not directly cause anything except injury, but it does not directly cause a beneficial change in the body. The exercise is a threatful stimulus. And if that stimulus crosses a certain threshold, the body adapts by making a functional improvement to protect itself against that negative threat. But having done that, you then need to allow your body adequate time to make the adaptation.
Yes.
So you need time to generate the enzymatic changes in your biochemistry to upregulate your metabolism. You need the time to synthesize new tissue de novo. And if you bring the stimulus back to the body before it's made its adaptation, you will interfere with the adaptation and retrogress. If you got to go to boot camp for a military academy and you need to be able to do 25 chin-ups, well, you need the functional strength. You need to strength train so with weight go to failure and have skeletal muscle improvements. But to make the most of that skeletal muscle's capacity in a given movement, then greasing the groove, what you're doing there is you're beating a neuromotor jog trail to optimize the function of that particular movement. So stated differently, you can grease the groove for chin-ups and your chin-up performance will improve. But if you grease the groove for chin-ups, it's not going to do a thing for your push-ups. You got to grease the groove for the push-ups. That is skill training. So skill training is going to be submaximal effort that avoids fatigue, but encodes the neuromotor pathway of efficiency over and over and over again through rehearsal.
Okay.
So that's the problem, is people are continually conflating physical training and skill training, because in some degree they overlap, but the intent is entirely different. Physical training is purely oriented towards fatigue with no concern for skill. And then the strength adaptation and the conditioning adaptation that occurs from that can be applied to any skill. But the development of that skill is through skill rehearsal, which involves appropriate repetition and avoidance of fatigue. Physical training is to produce a generic, broad-based physiologic adaptation. Like, for instance, I see BMX racers now, when they do their rate training, a lot of them are doing power cleans because they think it mimics the movements of BMX and the motor groups involved in BMX.
Yeah.
And then that's going to improve their performance, when really it doesn't. You're not, because it's ballistic and lots of momentum is involved, the muscle is discontinuously loaded, you're not really fatiguing the targeted musculature in a way to produce an adaptation. And then the skill you're developing is very specific for power cleans, but it does not translate into snapping out of the gate or a gate start or sprint power. They would take skateboarders and let them try, slalom water skiing, or they take skateboarders and take them out surfing, thinking, oh, they got all these generalized skills.
Similarities. Yeah.
It does not translate. You cannot take a BMX trick rider and have them do any sort of skill on a skateboard or vice versa. You can't even take a BMX trick rider and very successfully have them translate into mountain bike trick riding, because the skills are super, super specific for that thing. And most people, when they go in the gym, they are focused extrinsically. They are thinking about doing something to the weights with their muscles.
Yes, yes.
What we're going after is not performance. We're not trying to make the weight go up and down as many times as possible. We're using the weight as a tool to load the muscle, to produce rapid and deep fatigue. So on every movement, even if it's cammed in a really idealized piece of machinery, there is a point in the range of motion, usually due to joint angle issues, where there is a sticking point, where it's harder than everywhere else. At that point in the range of motion, you are going to most aggressively recruit motor units. So in a given targeted muscle, a motor unit is, say, 1,000 fibers scattered homogeneously throughout the muscle, innervated by a single nerve, like a wire going to a spark plug. Well, you have like 1,000 different motor units in this muscle, all spread about homogeneously, each with their own nerve. Those are all firing in rapid, random fashion, like the pistons of your car, like an 8-cylinder car. But when you get in that mid portion where you're really aggressively loading the muscle and it can't escape from the load and the fatigue, what's happening is you're recruiting more and more motor units and fatiguing them. And those motor units drop out. And as those motor units drop out, it's like you're pulling the plug, like you're pulling a spark plug on your car. So when you go from 8 cylinders down to 4 cylinders, the rapid firing is no longer enough to make it smooth movement. So it'll be slower because you got fewer motor units. It's like you pulled a spark plug and now the engine's running rough. That's the tremor that you felt. You're actually demonstrating the falling out of motor units at that particular portion of the range of motion because the fatigue is so aggressive. Over time, you get stronger. So in that sticking point, you're not knocking out as many motor units as you were previously. So you're able to smooth that out because you don't have as few motor units firing at that point. What you're doing in the gym, because you get your ego tied up in the extrinsic.
Yeah.
How much weight can I make go up and down 10 times? That's not the issue. It's how can I use the weight to, in continuous fashion, load and fatigue the muscle? If you're doing it better, you may get less reps. It may look less impressive on paper, but what you've done internally is actually more beneficial. In this field, they refer to the result of proper exercise being what's called inroading. And inroading is the percentage weakening of your muscle at the end of the set. So if your muscle starts out 100 units strong, if you continuously load the muscle and fatigue it at the end of the set, you may have decreased your strength by 60%. And then there's outroading. And outroading is when you're extrinsically focused. You may select a weight that's too heavy, and then you may use bracing of the muscles and using the bone-on-bone tower of locking up your joints to be able to demonstrate a better extrinsic performance. But in so doing, you are throwing out a lot of extra energy that is not being directed towards the stimulus.
Okay.
You can do an upper body chest press exercise and deeply fatigue the muscle with not a large amount of mechanical work being done and not a large amount of extrinsic force being spent on the body. Or you can take a sledgehammer and beat a tractor tire with it. That's not targeting any specific muscle group very directly. It's not producing a depth of fatigue that's going to result in an adaptation, but you've done an ass load of mechanical work and you've transmitted very high forces to your body. That is difficult to recover from. Someone that's oriented extrinsically, that is just trying to make the weight go up on that last rep by hook or crook by any means possible, is outroading a lot of extraneous energy, and they are consuming a lot of neurotransmitter from the motor strip of the brain through the spinal cord all the way down to the motor end plate of the muscle. That exhaustion of neurotransmitter for no productive purpose will leave you fatigued for days. It gives you what we in the field call ROBAT, and that stands for run over by a truck. We are trying to build strength when we're working out. We're not trying to demonstrate strength. To me, when I'm training clients or when I'm training myself, the weight really doesn't matter. The weight, and my clients are blinded to the weight that they're using. The weight is just a mechanism to load the muscle to aggressively recruit and fatigue motor units. Increasing the weight in and of itself doesn't necessarily accomplish that better. If it gets them to feel panicky and all of a sudden they're using bracing techniques and grunting and jabbing at the weight that results in discontinuous muscular loading, then the stimulus and the building of strength is compromised in order to demonstrate strength. Weight training has always had this weird dichotomy because most weight training with a barbell, the barbell is such a, it goes straight down to the center of the earth. It's relatively inefficient for loading the structures you're trying to train. So as a consequence, you got to put a disproportionate amount of weight on a barbell when you're doing a squat in order to transmit any meaningful load to the hip and thigh musculature. So it looks cool because you're putting these plates that are as big as manhole covers on the bar, and it's a lot of weight, but what's actually getting delivered is load to the targeted musculature because of the inefficiency of the mechanics is actually quite small. But with a properly designed piece of equipment, you can be using a lot less extrinsic weight, but the loading on the musculature is way, way better. If you don't believe that, just go lean up against the wall with your hips and knees at 90 degrees and do a wall sit for as long as you can. In the last 10 seconds of that, that'll be harder than any set of squats you ever did. You don't have to hit a particular muscle group from a lot of different angles. The key to hitting all the muscle group is the fatigue. Because you're going to get motor units in all corners of that musculature stimulated if you invoke enough fatigue, because then you will recruit all the motor units available throughout the entire architecture of the targeted muscle. Yeah, you can't mind control your way to that level of fatigue. You can mind control your way to that level of motor control in a muscle group, but you still need the resistance and the loading to be continuous in order to invoke the level of fatigue that you need to stimulate that adaptation. So when you're invoking that kind of fatigue, it requires a lot of conscious mental control, because what you're doing is, again, you're threatening your most preserved biologic function. You're training until you can't move the way you can't move. Movement is your most preserved biologic function. Without it, you can't eat, you can't get food, you can't keep from becoming food. So when that sort of fatigue gets invoked, we have all sorts of instincts that make us want to rebel against that. Set it down, give up, jab at the weight, try to invoke momentum, brace with your bones. But if we have an intellectual override of all those instincts to try to really go after the stimulus intrinsically, it's extremely uncomfortable. It invokes a lot of emotion, a lot of panic, and it goes against every instinct that we have. But in terms of making somatic awareness, it works better than anything, because all of that pain, all of that fatigue, and all of that panic activates the limbic system, which is the more primitive portion of your brain where your amygdala is. And there is one synapse between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. One synapse, which is why when you do anything, when you're learning any skill or you're doing anything, if you do it in an environment where there is stress and pain involved, it's learned much more quickly and ingrained much more permanently. They call it limbic learning. That's talked all day long about, in jiu-jitsu, you don't want to get arm barred, but once you get arm barred, because of the pain involved in the limbic learning, then you've really learned the lesson.